We explored the principles of Leviticus 25 in our last episode, and we developed a biblical definition of slavery as a form of moral or financial debt, and applied the concept of moral debt to Leviticus 25 as it pertains to those parts of Scripture which speak of Israel enslaving nation states in Canaan after negotiating terms of peace or warfare with them. But now we need to explore the financial debt aspect of Leviticus 25 as well. But before doing that, since I already defined a slave in the last episode, let me take a quick moment to put forth the definition I'm operating on for the term servant, which is a much broader scope of usage when employed in the Bible. A slave is working for someone else for the purpose of paying off some kind of debt to that person. A servant is also working for someone else, but it wasn't necessarily for the purpose of paying off debt. A slave has the weight of obligated liability, but the servant may not. Though both are working for someone else, all slaves are servants, but not all servants are slaves, because a servant can merely be a hired worker. A servant may just be someone who is not in any debt at all, but is working for someone else to gain their wages for their living. There wouldn't be any moral obligation for the servant to continue working for their employer if they wanted to leave to work for themselves in a more free manner, or even if they just wanted to begin working for someone else. So, having put that aside, let's talk about Leviticus 25 a little more, because parts of Leviticus 25 talk of individuals selling themselves into contracted labor. And when this was done, whether purchasing a slave from a vassal nation that was already conquered, or from one of the sojourners that came from one of the nations around them, a bargaining process is indicated in the text concerning the number of years agreed upon for a bartered wage of the slave who was selling himself. And if the time period agreed upon will be long enough for that slave to have and raise children of his own while in slavery, what becomes of those children? That's what this episode is going to focus on. Does that child, then, of that slave automatically become a slave as well upon growing up? Does the master have automatic and direct slave authority over the children of his slaves, bypassing the authority of their own father? Based on how we've defined slavery, let me put it another way. Does the child of an indebted slave inherit the debt of the father? Because for the master to have such direct authority over the children of his slaves necessarily implies that the debt of the father would be inherited to the son. So we will explore the Bible and what it says about this, but let me remind the listener again about the two different kinds of debts that are the foundation behind the concept of slavery: moral debt and financial debt. And I want to say in passing that this distinction in these two different kinds of slavery is something that even biblical scholars adhere to. Though they come up with different names for them than what I do, the concept itself is pretty well agreed upon. And those definitions I argued for from scriptures have been established in the last episode. So let's first look at moral debt. Can a child inherit moral debt from their father? One of the fundamental laws of the Old Testament that drives what just treatment should look like between the inhabitants of Israel is the law in Deuteronomy that says sons are not to be put to death for the sins of their father. Now, even though this law says that the death penalty is not to be enacted on the son for someone else's capital crime, the spirit and principle of this law establishes that any crime of the father should not fall on the shoulders of the son. So according to this law, can a child be guilty of the sins of the father? Can the son inherit moral debt? The clear and obvious answer from the law in Deuteronomy is a hard and fast no. And this would mean that the master has no moral or biblical grounds at all to bypass his slave's authority as a father in order to access his children to become his own slaves. So that settles the issue, right? Well, I would say that it does, but there would be some objections to this conclusion based on what other parts of Scripture appear to show. So we're going to look at those objections soon. But let me say real quick that these laws from God given to Israel are laws for humanity. They are not laws from God for God himself to follow. When God commands us not to be jealous, that in no way, shape, or form implies that God cannot be jealous. He is, in fact, a jealous God. And it would be ill-founded of an approach to demand an omniscient sovereign God be subject to laws that were meant for and designed for a limited fallen humanity. Because while God says he will visit the iniquity of the people to their third and fourth generations, that is not God commanding humanity to carry out such a thing. It is God declaring what he will carry out directly on his own. And he commands humanity to not put onto the Son the sins of the Father. So that if or when a slave master does treat the children of his slaves as if they are his own de facto slaves, he would be in violation of this law. He would be in violation of this law if he treated the son of his slave as if the son carried a moral debt, because the son, in fact, does not inherit moral debt of the father, as we see accordingly to the law in Deuteronomy I just quoted. But this point I'm making is in regards to moral debt. Can the same be said of financial debt? Can the financial debt of the father be inherited by the son? Well, my answer to that question is yes and no. Now, hear me out here, because I'm not trying to be cute or evasive when it comes to financial debt. The answer is actually defined. It's just dependent. Because while I believe it is inaccurate to say that the son of a slave is born into moral slavery to his father's master, I don't think it's inaccurate to say that the son of a slave is born into slavery just in general. In the same way that it's not inaccurate to say that the son of a rich man is born into riches, or the son of a poor man is born into poverty. So it is accurate to say that children can be born into houses of slavery, such as in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 7, where Solomon declares such a thing amongst his lists of many pleasures. He says in the ESV, I bought male and female slaves. I had slaves who were born in my house. Which might seem to imply that these children were born not simply into houses of slavery, but were born as automatic de facto slaves to Solomon's authority. But this is simply a bad translation. It's well within the slave's authority of his own children to decide to have his son help with the father's slave work once he's old enough or capable enough to work. But the Hebrew of that verse does not say that Solomon acquired slaves because they were born in his house. No, the Hebrew actually says that he had sons because they were born in his house. Where the ESV says slaves born, the Hebrew word in that spot where the ESV says slaves is actually sons, not slaves. So Solomon had sons that were born in his house. And this verse is not specific enough to know if Solomon was talking about children who were simply growing up and decided to become servants to him, which in no way undermines or bypasses the parent's authority, or if the sons were literally Solomon's own begotten sons, because the female slaves referred to in that verse might have been Solomon's concubines, which were a type of female slave. But in that case, that would not be slaves to Solomon. That would be his very own children. The very next verse, verse 8, speaks with reference to these concubines. So I think it's more likely that these children spoken of were Solomon's very own children, not slaves. But even if they were not, even if they were children of his slaves that decided to work with their own father for Solomon upon growing up in this house, there's no evidence in this verse at all to indicate the children were under any obligation to fulfill a contract of slavery, let alone a lifetime of slavery, just because of the status of their father. But just like any children of any family at any point in history, the socioeconomic standing of the father is going to affect the lifestyle and conditions of the son. But that's by virtue of the fact that the father has natural authority as the begetter and provider to his family, just like any family is, even today. And those effects on the children are not by virtue of any direct access the father's master has over children. I say direct because the master does not have direct authoritative access to the child without going through the father first. So the master does have indirect influence on that son by virtue of the fact that he controls the wages and living of his own slave, which is the father of these children. And that will have secondary effects on how the children of that slave will live and experience life. But that effect from the master is not in circumnavigation of the father's authority. Rather, it's through the father that it happens, which just reiterates the first-hand authority over that children is the father, not the slave master. So keeping that in mind, let's revisit the question. Does the child of a slave inherit his father's financial debt? The answer to that question is yes, but only insofar as that child is reliant on the collateralized provisions from that father. You understand that? The child only inherits financial debt to the degree that the child is in need of those provisions which the father pledged in stake of his debt. The reason this is dependent is because obviously the younger a child is, the more reliant they will be. And the older the child is, the less reliant they will be. But this is the same way all families operate throughout history, even up to today. The debt of your father is inherited the same way today as it was in biblical times.
Joanne is with us in Palm Springs, California. Hey, Joanne, how are you?
I'm doing very well, sir. How are you?
Better than I deserve. What's up?
I just have a question about if it's possible to inherit debt.
No.
No. Okay. Even if your name is on the person, my name's not on any of this things like the house, the RV, boat, all that.
If your name is not on the debt, it's not your debt.
Okay, but my name, it's my dad. He said he put my name on his bank account. Would that give them ammunition to come after me?
No, but they got that bank account.
Right. That's I didn't bother telling him, but that was pointless.
Yeah, anything that he owns will be used to pay off his debt when he passes away. If he doesn't own enough to pay off all of his debt, someone's not going to get paid. You don't inherit debt. But now, if you're including his inheritance in something that's yours, then that's going to be used up to pay off debt before you get anything. So it's assets minus liabilities. What you own minus what you owe is your net worth, and the net of the debt is the only estate that he has. It's the only inheritance that he has. And so if he has $100,000 in credit card debt and $10,000 in a bank account, and he's got RV loans and a bunch of other stuff, there's not going to be an inheritance here.
It's rather funny to me how I answered this question with a yes, and Dave Ramsey in the clip answered the question with a no. But we're both saying the exact same thing. The lady on the phone is saying if she inherits her father's debt, and Ramsey immediately said, no, you don't. But he started adding qualifiers like if you're going to rely on the bank account that is under his name, or if your name is on it too, then it's gone to the debt. If you want to receive an inheritance from your father, it's gone to the debt. If you want to keep those things, if you don't want to lose those things, those provisions, because you're reliant on them, that means you're going to have to work for the lender in order to maintain them. Otherwise, they're taken away from you. So if you are capable of being independent of those provisions, then you do not have to be a slave to the lender upon your father's death. And this brings up a specific story in the Bible where such a situation took place. And it's found in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, where Elisha comes upon a woman who is in fear of her children being taken as slaves because they inherited their dead father's debt. Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house?" And she said, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons, and pour into all these vessels. And when one is full, set it aside." So she went from him, shut the door behind herself and her sons. And as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." Now, many have claimed that this story is proof that a creditor owns the debt holder as a slave and the debt holder's children as slaves, because this story demonstrates that the creditor had a right to these children as his slaves and to collect them as such. But is this really the case? Is it true that the creditor had a right to these children as his own slaves? Let's look at what the law says. But before doing that, just think for 5 seconds about how this story is portrayed in the Bible. The woman in distress is clearly portrayed as the victim, and the creditor of the story is clearly portrayed as the villain. And Elisha, with the power of God, is portrayed as the hero. It doesn't take a scholar to figure out that the creditor here is acting with evil intent. And to be acting with evil intent is to be in violation of the law, not in fulfillment of the law. So let's go over what laws the creditor is violating. The first one is one I've already mentioned, because it's the fundamental basis upon which all these other laws I'm going to go over is built. And that is, the son is not to be put to death for the sins of his father, nor the father for the sins of his son, but each is to be put to death for their own sins. This clearly shows, in my opinion, that the creditor had no right to treat the sons as if they owed him a debt, simply because their deceased father did, and the mother in this story shows that she has no provisions to live on except for a jar of oil. Now, I don't know if the listener has ever seen real poverty before, but this is a state of real poverty. Her husband was in debt for the rest of his life until his death, with his family living in that condition. And now all she has to survive is a jar of oil and her 2 sons. Taking any of this away from their family would certainly be a detriment to their well-being and livelihood. And the law has something to say about taking away the sources of livelihood from a family that is in debt. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 6 says, "No one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge." This law dictates that you are never to collect the collateral from a slave when they are dependent upon that collateral for their very livelihood, and that this law is to be respected regardless of if the slave was a Hebrew or a foreigner. To violate this law would be oppressing their very ability to even live. So we already see that the creditor of 1 Kings is already in violation of this law. The same section concerning debt slaves says in verse 12 through 13, it says, "And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God." The parallel law to that one is found in Exodus 22, where it says, "If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep?" And in the law's articulation of this principle of respecting the necessities of the slave's livelihood, the law extends this principle to all slaves, Hebrew and foreign, when it says in the very next part of the law in Deuteronomy 24, verse 14, "You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. The reason I'm so convinced that the law saying fathers should not be put to death for the sins of their children sums up what all these other laws on debt slavery is getting at is because that's the very next verse after these laws. And then, in verse 17, the law forbidding the taking of collateral debt hits very close to home with the situation of the woman with oil jars because it speaks directly to the widow's situation. It says, "You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge." Now, the widow in 1 Kings was being threatened by a creditor who was going to take from something which was much more close to her than just her garment, but her very children. And in doing that, he would be violating every single one of these laws and the principles they communicate if he were to force his way into taking these things from her. Verse 10 of the same chapter says, "When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you." So then one has to wonder, why is it that Elisha helped this woman to pay her debt? Why didn't Elisha just remind the creditor of the law and tell him to let it go? That he is to show mercy to this woman and her children and to follow the law. Let me put it another way. Does Elisha's participation in helping the woman make payment of the debt to the creditor give any legitimacy to the creditor's claim? You see, the laws I just read to you were read from the perspective of how the creditor should conduct himself in giving out loans and collecting on them. But these laws also have something to say for the conduct of the slave in what type of assets he should or should not be giving as collateral for that debt that he takes on. Because while the letter of the law articulates that mercy should be shown, the law never ignores the fact that if that mercy is shown, it still results in loss of payment to the creditor. In other words, just because the master has no right to collect on a debt which could oppress the ability of the slave to live and survive doesn't mean that the creditor isn't owed anything. The debt is still real, and the creditor is still short of a liability that he was owed. The very fact that the law demands mercy to the slave presupposes that something is forgiven which is actually owed. And to be forgiven of that which has failed to be fulfilled is to be forgiven of the sin of failing to pay back that which the slave was in agreement by contract to pay back. It's breaking of the contract. So these laws are just as important for the slave to abide by, so that he doesn't agree to any terms which would put him in the position of failing to fulfill the payment of that debt, because that would be taking advantage of his master. That would be abusing these laws of mercy if the slave hid behind them to get away with exploiting the resources of the creditor given to him. The wisdom literature of the Bible reiterates this importance to the slave. In Proverbs chapter 22, verses 24 through 27, it says, "Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. Be not one of those who give pledges, who put up security for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should your bed be taken from under you?" The wisdom of this passage is to reiterate to the slave, specifically, to not be in dealings with men who will ensnare you, to not put yourself in a position where you are subject of having your livelihood taken from you in collateral. This verse doesn't mean that the creditor could take away your bed. He would be wrong to do so. But it's also wrong for the slave to make such arrangements, especially if it is in dealings with men who do not respect the law of God, who wouldn't care about abiding by its articulated mercies. And this is a reality that happened to Israel when they became captured and subject to other peoples, such as the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans. The letter of the law given in Deuteronomy and the spirit of the law given here in Proverbs shows that it is the responsibility of the slave to keep himself protected from exploitation. And it's the responsibility of the slaveholder to not exploit. So I go through all of that to say that it's quite fascinating to me that Elisha helps the woman to still pay this creditor's debt. You would think that if this story was made up, conventional storytelling would have the hero protect the damsel from the attempted exploitation, even by physical prevention, if necessary. But that's not how the story goes. The law of God, as Elisha himself knows, observes the debt owed to the creditor, while also observing the oppression it places on the widow. In other words, Elisha and the law of God is observing the justice owed and the mercy due in this situation. And he works to resolve this conflict by satisfying both, by giving the creditor his justice and the widow her mercy. And the only way this occurs is by the act of the divine, where justice and mercy both meet in the actions of Elisha to display the power of God in the working of this supernatural act. This unique story of Elisha, in my opinion, is a shadow of the coming redemption of Israel in the work of Jesus Christ, where on the cross, justice and mercy are both satisfied in the intervention of the divine. But my main point in this video is not to focus on the theological ramifications of this story, only to show that the law of God in these matters is truly just, regardless of how neglectful the sinful men may be to it. Remember, in the last episode where I introduced to the listener the teaching from Jesus that principles of mercy are built right into the law of Moses. And here we see time and time again the laws of mercy being implemented as protections to not only the slaves, but to their children as well. And this fact is irresponsibly ignored by atheists and hostile skeptics because it undermines in a very consistent way their attempts to vilify the law of God. This is the claim of even many educated atheists, scholars, who have spent their lives in the Bible. Here's one such scholar, Dr. Joshua Bowen, who is a studied Assyriologist and atheistic historian, make this very claim when addressing the story. In this clip, he mocks Christians who have failed to face up to the plain texts of slavery in the Bible.
And something that I think needs to be pointed out again is that there seems to be this, presumption in the way that he presents and other apologists present this is that it's just indentured servitude, right? It's just debt slavery. Now, set aside any argument that we might make from trying to describe what debt slavery is. Just let the Bible speak for itself, right? If you go to 2 Kings 4:1, you'll see an example of a woman who is not super excited about her kids being taken into debt slavery, right? So I'll just read it here.
Doesn't she understand that this is a hand up?
Yeah, it's a great thing. Now, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, "It's a great day. Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord, and now the creditor has come to take my 2 children as his slaves. Praise for his blessings." Oh, sorry. That's not what I.
Are you reading from the new Frank Turek version of
right.
the Bible there?
Yeah, not what the text says, right? She's crying out for help. Now, technically, according to the law, this would have been volitional. This is a voluntary, because the husband took out some, took on some form of debt. They were unable to pay it back, and now the creditor is coming to exercise his legal right to either take distrainees or to take just as debt slaves. And even if he follows to the letter of the law, he gets the kids, right? He gets to keep them for a period of time. And like, she's not excited. She's not going, whoo, oh, now I don't have to find a way to feed him or something. Man, what? Thank you, Mr. Creditor.
Oh,
Like, give me a break. It's like they don't even know their own Bible.
You heard him say several times that the creditor in the story of Elisha was acting in accordance to the letter of the law. But we have just gone over what the letter of the law is in this matter, and everything this creditor was attempting to do would be in direct contradiction to the letter of the law. Now, it may be possible that Dr. Josh is thinking in his head about a law in Exodus 21, but I'm going to go over that particular chapter in another video because that particular law concerning the children of slaves does not ever refer to those children as being slaves. And I'm going to present a case when I go over that passage of how those children were not taken as slaves, but rather were adopted as children by the master. And justifiably so. But again, you have to be patient with me. I'll get to that episode in due time. For now, I just want you to see that every letter of the law on this matter is in contradiction of what Dr. Josh is implying here. And not only the letter, but even the spirit of the law as well. In the book of Job, chapter 23, Job states that he has closely followed the steps of God, not turning aside from his ways, and that Job has not, quote, departed from the commands of his lips. And then in the next chapter, chapter 24, Job bemoans the evils of this world and how many times they seem to go unpunished. And in his list of evil deeds performed by the wicked, verse 9 says, there are those who snatch the fatherless child from the breast, and they take a pledge against the poor. This is precisely the situation we see happening with Elisha, the widow, and the creditor of 1 Kings, where Job is declaring the attempted act of the creditor to be among the acts of those who are conjuring up for themselves judgment from the Lord. And Job does this in contradistinction of himself, who has not departed from God's commands.
How did the United States of America get slaves after they outlawed the international slave trade? They bred them. And that's exactly what Exodus 21 describes. Hey, if you go into debt slavery and then your master gives you a wife, he keeps the kids. So you can not ever trade or kidnap or anything, and you can still get permanent slaves by just breeding your debt slaves.
Now, this content creator's accusation of slave breeding is based on his reading of Exodus 21. And full disclosure, I don't believe Exodus 21 teaches slave breeding for keeping slaves in slavery forever. So I'm going to cover that chapter in another episode. But for now, I want you to see how that accusation is already in contradiction to all the laws we've covered so far. And assuming that the creditor of the widow in 2 Kings with Elisha was trying to accomplish that, was trying to accomplish slave breeding, it stands condemned by the Bible in so many other places because it's treating the children of slaves as if they are guilty of their father's sins. Now, this content creator and myself do agree that that passage in Exodus 21, which he is using as a reference, is referencing Hebrew slaves. So his accusation is that Hebrews had moral authority by the Bible to breed other Hebrew slaves, and that this level of authority that a Hebrew slave master had bypasses even the authority of a slave father over his own children if the master wanted those children as his own slaves. That's his accusation. So let's consider a few more things with this in mind. If my claim is true, that the master of a slave's children has no direct authority over that child, nor has any moral grounds to bypass the authority of the parents, then that necessarily means that the accusation from skeptics against the Bible, saying that it protects a practice of breeding slaves, so to keep them in perpetual slavery from generation to generation, is patently false. It's a false accusation because it would violate the principle of protecting the children from the sins of the father, just like we've clearly displayed in all these laws up to this point. So because we've comprehensively established that it is the parents who have first-hand primary authority over their own children as their children, before and above any master has authority over those same children as his slaves, a corollary to that deduction would be that the children of slaves have freedom from the master of their father, and decisions concerning the actions, status, and futures of these children are in the hands of the parents first, and are determined between the family itself, not the slave father's master. So then you might be curious to know if this corollary truth is seen more explicitly in the narratives of the Bible. Well, let me present one possible case. In 1 Kings 19, at the end of the chapter, the prophet Elijah meets Elisha, and Elisha is working in the fields. When Elijah calls Elisha to ministry, Elisha first requests that he gets to say goodbye to his parents first. And Elijah responds with telling him that he's under no obligation to follow him. But Elisha does. He goes back to say his goodbyes and slaughters the oxen as a sacrifice to eat and to celebrate this final meal with the people before leaving to serve Elijah. The reason I say this is only a possible example is because it's not a very strong one. We see Elisha is working in the fields, but we don't know if his father, who goes by the name of Shaphat, is himself an indebted slave to another master. One reason to conclude that Shaphat may be a slave, Shaphat being the father of Elisha, is from the conclusion that Elisha did not receive an inheritance from his father upon saying his goodbyes. Now, you can contrast this with the practice of granting inheritance upon departure to the son in the parable of the prodigal son. The son received in that parable his inheritance first before departing from his father and mother, which is proof that in the story of the prodigal son, the father was a free man. Because free men had inheritances to give, but slaves had no inheritances to give, since they were still in the process of getting out of the debt before they could start accumulating their own wealth. And if it's true that Elisha did not receive an inheritance, then it's true that Shaphat was a debt slave. And if Shaphat was a debt slave, then this would be an example where the son of a slave chooses on his own accord to say goodbye to his parents and leave in his own independence and freedom, all without having any regard about the say of the father's master. The weakest part of this example I'm giving is the fact that it is an argument from silence. Meaning, just because the text does not say that Elisha received an inheritance, does not mean that Elisha didn't receive an inheritance. I grant that. I grant that from the outset. And some may be swayed to believe that the oxen slaughtered for the final meal in that story was the inheritance. But the text doesn't say that either. So, at best, we have an example that is corroborated by all the other laws of the Bible that we have gone through already. It's just not an example that explicitly displays this truth on its own merit by itself because of the aspect of the argument from silence that it relies upon. And so to be consistent, I have to admit the weakness of this interpretation at the outset. This brings up the nature of arguments from silence real quick. I have to say, arguments from silence are not necessarily fallacious, but they are fallacious if they try to argue for an idea based on what isn't in the text in contradiction to what is explicitly stated in the text. And even if they aren't in contradiction to what is explicitly stated in the text, they may or may not be weaker forms of argumentation depending on what the alternatives being considered are. And in this case, I would say that because I cannot definitively prove that Elisha absolutely did not receive an inheritance, that this would be a weaker argument to use as an example trying to prove that the children of slaves had no inherent obligation to the master of their father. So the listener is left wondering if I have any other example. Do I have an example that does prove more convincingly that parents have more authority over their own children than does the slave master of the father. I'm sorry to say that this is where the weakest part of my entire approach becomes apparent, because I do not have such an explicit case. No, I'm just kidding. I have it. It's in Nehemiah chapter 5. The setting of this chapter is that the people of Israel have returned from exile back to the land of Israel and are trying to reestablish their temple amidst the foreign nations around them. And the people of Israel are facing distress and oppression due to famine and the abusive slavery practices being overseen by the Jewish officials, resulting in a cycle of debt bondage. This is an example in Scripture of the worst abuses against the Mosaic law concerning how debt slavery should be conducted, especially between Hebrew brothers. And when Nehemiah confronts the officials, starting in verse 7, it says, I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. And I held a great assembly against them and said to them, we, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations. But you even sell your brothers, that they may be sold to us. They were silent and could not find a word to say. So I said, the thing you are doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God, to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? Notice that Nehemiah, in confronting the officials, is pulling directly from the laws of Leviticus to condemn the practices of the officials. The officials were charging interest on their own Hebrew brothers and even selling them as slaves to the foreign nations. Whereas Leviticus 25 says, in verse 35, if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. The officials were not treating their famine-stricken brothers like strangers or sojourners, according to this law, but were treating them worse than one would treat a foreigner. The next verse says, take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. And then later on in Leviticus 25, verse 47 and onward, it teaches that in the case of a Hebrew being sold to a foreigner, the law provides for all kinds of ways to get that brother out of slavery from that foreign nation. And here the officials were purposefully putting the Hebrews into slavery to foreign nations. And according to Nehemiah, it was causing the laughter and mockery of the enemy nations because foreign nations were benefiting from being treated better than the Hebrew slaves themselves were, which is also in contradiction of what Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6 says. That should have been happening if the Jews were following the law rightly, because it states about the laws, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, or in the sight of the nations, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Nehemiah had these statutes all in mind when he was condemning the officials, because the nations ended up making money while mocking the Israelites for their irresponsible handling of their own debt workers. And the way Nehemiah came to find out about all these abuses of the law was several verses beforehand when the people were talking to him. And in that conversation, we learn how the children of these slaves were being treated underneath this rule of anti-biblical oppressive slavery. Because the people say to Nehemiah in verse 5, now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers. Our children are as their children, yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves. Pause. The people here are pointing out that the officials are their very own Hebrew brethren, and yet they are not treating them accordingly. Notice that this doesn't mean that the people are saying they are being treated as if they are foreigners, but rather what I think it means is that they are being treated far worse than if they were foreigners, even though they are their own Hebrew flesh and blood. The verse goes on, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it. Now, I'm sure the listener at this point is thinking, this doesn't bode well for your theory here, because it sounds like the people who are in debt slavery are saying that their own children are now enslaved as well against the wishes and efforts of even the parents. So it seems like the creditors and or the slave masters here are the ones forcing authority over the children of these slaves in circumnavigation of the parents' authority. So isn't this just another case of just more slave masters who are no different than the one that Elisha and the widow with 2 kids had to deal with? No, it's not. It's not the same scenario, because the full verse says this. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. They are saying it's not in our power to help it because other men have our fields and vineyards. It isn't that other men have come to collect our children. It isn't other men used force of the sword or threats or exercised authority over our children before we could. No, that's not what they're saying. They're saying it says that other men have our fields and vineyards. What the people are saying here is that our very source of financial income has already been pledged and collected. So we as parents have no other financial means to pay our debts. We as a family had no other source of income but to make the decision ourselves as parents and as a family to sell our children into slavery as well. The parents felt forced into this situation, not because the slave master made any kind of direct authoritative decision over their children, bypassing the parents' authority, no, but because the parents themselves made the authoritative decision based on their own assessment of their financial situation as a family. The people didn't say that others subdued their children into slavery. They said that we subdued our children into slavery, which proves that it is the parents of the family who have first authority over their own children, even if the parents are slaves, before and above any master that the father is indebted to. Do you see that? This text is more convincing of this truth claim I'm making than even the last example of Elisha leaving his parents would have been if I could prove explicitly that his father Shaphat was a slave, or even if I could prove that Elisha didn't receive an inheritance, because in this text in Nehemiah 5, while it was a heinous sin for the people to have pressed onto them this extreme level of usury, it creates the perfect scenario in the eyes of hostile readers for their accusation of Hebrew slave breeding to be proven and to be demonstrated. It's the perfect scenario for them to demonstrate that children of slaves were themselves slaves due to the master having supreme authority over the children of their slaves. And yet, in this perfect scenario, we see the complete opposite of that happening. We see that the children of these slaves did become slaves, but not because of any slave master exercising any kind of a direct authority over these children at all, but rather because of the parents themselves, by their own decisions, in their own families. And even then, Nehemiah condemned it because it had gotten out of hand. So I don't see how slave breeding can even be a possibility with all these texts that we've gone over. But I suppose the one and only text that hostiles have to stand on for that kind of accusation comes from their faulty reading of Exodus 21. So we're going to explore that chapter in our next episode.